So these are zoonotic, really severe zoonotic bacterial infections. I can't even say if they fevers or not. I'm going to start with the Francisella. Francisella tularensis. Causative agent of tularemia. Okay. Now, basically, it's a really bad fever. Okay, bad bacterial systemic disease. It can have cutaneous form or respiratory form. Sometimes it is called rabbit fever because rabbits serve as the reservoir for Francisella tularensis. Does that make sense so far? So, cutaneous form of the infection is more common among people who hunt rabbits. When they kill an animal and they skin an animal, they can inadvertently expose damaged skin to the blood, and that causes the cutaneous form, which is relatively mild. Does that make sense? Now, what about respiratory form? Well, in nature, usually, here's what happens. I know it sounds terrible, but some folks acquire it when they run over a rabbit, whether dead or alive, with a lawnmower. And they basically vaporize the rabbit, okay? And they inhale and get the infection. It's not frequent. What's interesting about Francisella, along with Bacillus anthracis, it was, at some point, it was a candidate for a biological weapon, and allegedly Soviet troops tried Francisella as a biological weapon during the siege of Stalingrad because there was an outbreak of tularemia among German troops. And again, allegedly there are documents in Soviet archives that actually suggest that it was a trial of sorts. Make sense? Now, we're going to move on to probably the most exciting one, which is Yersinia. So the first one is Yersinia enterocolytica. Gastroenteritis. It may be actually very long-term, up to chronic, like it can last for months. If it's left untreated, it can last for months. It's not going to kill a person, okay? So gastroenteritis, from feral dogs and cats. And, okay, I wrote it and I immediately kind of started to question myself. Not fully feral, but let's put it this way. Imagine that there's a dog that kind of runs around but comes back home and spends a night there maybe and then runs around. So like not really domestic dog, not really feral, kind of in between. Does that make sense?
So like outside, I have barn cats.
Yeah, sure. They could bring it, okay? Usually you have to have a close encounter with poop, like really close encounter. So more common among kids because they're more likely to have close encounter with poop. That makes sense to you? So it's kind of also known as orphan disease. Orphan diseases are the ones that are often overlooked or neglected. So basically it's a disease that nobody cares about. You good so far? Brings us to Yersinia pestis. Causative agent of plague. Okay? So, reservoir for plague is rodents. Now, transmission can be kind of, there's several routes. Let's call it this way. So it is a zoonotic disease. fleas that feed on those rodents can either jump on humans directly, which is not particularly common. What's more common, listen, let's say you travel somewhere in Nevada, okay, and you have your dog with you, and your dog is a real good dog. He or she is not gonna like run away, but you let it off the leash, okay? So it runs around, chases all those rodents, all those prairie dogs, and maybe catches one or two, but the fleas find a new host and then jump on your dog. And then you go into the tent and you sleep together, and fleas jump on you and bite you. Make sense? So this is bubonic plague. Bubonic plague is characterized by necrotic adjacent lymph nodes. So if you get bitten, say somewhere like in the leg, it will be inguinal lymph nodes. If you get bitten somewhere in the chest, axillary lymph nodes. Does that make sense? Large black necrotic bubo. Now, bubonic plague has a mortality rate of about 70% if it's left untreated. And then it can progress to pneumonic or respiratory or pulmonary plague. And pneumonic plague can be transmitted from human to other human. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, pneumonic plague is when it is acquired by respiratory route, okay? About 90% mortality. And both of these may result in septicemic plague. So this is when microorganism starts to reproduce in the blood. We're talking about mortality rate of roughly 100%. And it is very, very quick. Does that make sense so far? Now, what is so fascinating about this? So first of all, there are reservoirs of plague all around the globe. In the United States, it's western states, particularly Nevada, probably northern Arizona. Some cases were recorded as far north as Idaho, so that area. So prairies, pretty dry areas, rodents there. Every year there are few cases of plague in the United States. Does that make sense? For instance, in Madagascar, there's a pretty large reservoir of plague. They experience regular outbreaks. There was one several years ago, and they started to worry for real because a lot of it was pneumonic transmission. It's a very treatable disease. Okay, antibiotics work very well. It is responsible for the word quarantine, which means 40 days. That's how long ships were supposed to be out in the harbor before they were allowed to get on the shore, because the idea was like everybody would die who were susceptible. It wiped off from 1/3 to half the European population in the 14th century. It's a very well known fact. That's what's created basically modern capitalism, because of the shortage of the labor market. But my favorite story, and I have just enough time to tell this, is I think I have this, let me see if I have this map. Yeah, I do have this little map in the lecture notes, which shows you the map of the United States with the plague cases, and they all concentrated in the southwest, okay? And there's one single case at the southern point of Lake Michigan, exactly where the city of Chicago is. And like, what the hell, right? How did that happen? So it turns out this case was reported in CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. There's a guy, professor of microbiology, studied vaccine against plague, and one day he comes to ER, complains for, it's like headaches and fever and, non-specific kind of symptoms. And they give him ibuprofen and send him out. Next day he gets to the ER by the ambulance because he's totally confused, super high fever, like he's in a really, really bad shape. They collect blood, send blood for culture, start him on broad-spectrum antibiotics. 24 hours later, he dies. He was in a really bad shape. And his blood work comes back positive for plague. What the hell? Turns out, well, of course, at the moment of admission, nobody knew that he was a microbiology professor. Turns out that the guy was working on the vaccine strain, the attenuated strain of Yersinia pestis. And like when you do something for like 20, 30 years, I don't need gloves, I don't need this, I know better. So he knew better. He accidentally inoculated himself with vaccine attenuated strain, which shouldn't have killed him. But the problem is, plague, Yersinia pestis, it loves iron. If there's a lot of iron in the medium, it grows really, really well. Does that make sense? This guy had a condition known as hemochromatosis, which is abnormally high levels of iron in the blood. So if that would be, say, me, I'd be fine. But in this fella, even this weak strain reproduced to such enormous numbers that it caused this, massive inflammation, sepsis, and he died. It doesn't really underscore anything except for the fact that even if you do something for like 30 years, doing the basic precautions is not a bad idea. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay, let's wrap it up.